Hello, everyone. Thank you for including me in this night. It's been so fun to be able to talk to many of you, to hear Last Stop performed live. It's just been thrilling. This started as a book that I wrote alone in a room, very lonely, a cat walking over my lap sometimes. And it's just incredible to see it become something so much bigger. I do want to acknowledge that I have a collaborator in this book, a brilliant artist named Christian Robinson, who is pictured here. And we've been on this journey together throughout many years, and we now have 2 more books together. And it's one of my favorite things of my career is developing a friendship with Christian. So, speaking of illustrators, I wanted to begin by sharing with you an image from another book I did, illustrated by Lauren Long, called Love. And young people know this just intuitively, that when you read a picture book, you read the words, of course, but you also read the pictures. Sometimes adults have to be reminded of this. I'm sure some of you are parents and you've been trying to get through the 3rd book of the night with a young person, and you want to just get through it so you can kind of move on with your night. And you turn the page and your young person in your life slams it, back down because they're still reading the visual story. So I've been using this image to start most of my talks when I go to schools, and I go to visit schools throughout the country now. So, I invite you to read this picture for a second, because it really, it kind of speaks to where I'm coming from as a writer and as an artist. Maybe you notice that there's a family gathered around what looks to be a TV. You can see it's multi-generational, right? There's a grandmother there, it looks like a grandchild. Maybe you'll go even deeper and you'll notice that this is a Mexican-American family, right? There's a couple clues here. A little insight. The illustrator asked me, hey, I wanted to make this a Mexican-American family like you mentioned. Can you tell me what was in your grandmother's house when you were growing up? And I was like, no problem. There's Jesus on the wall. And just in case people get the picture, there's also probably a cross. Frida Kahlo is somewhere in the house because she is very supportive of Frida Kahlo. There's a doily somewhere in the picture because I don't know if you guys know about that phase of our country's history where people put doilies on every open surface. She would do that. So this is also, you can see, a Mexican-American family. But then you might look a little bit deeper and you might see that the family is gathered around the TV, but there's one member of the family who's the youngest, who's come down the stairs because something's happening. And the reason I start every talk with this image is because while we are reading the news, listening to the news, watching the news, our youngest family members are watching us. That's the only way they know how to judge what's happening in this country at any given moment. Why is the TV blurred? Well, first of all, the truth is, whatever you might think it is today that's on the TV that's making them feel anxious, it's going to be something different in 2 days, in 2 weeks. So, of course, we want it to be, able to put in different context in different communities. But most importantly, we're also taking a point of view, right? So we're taking the point of view both as writer and as illustrator of this little girl. And that is what I do with all my books. Point of view is probably the most important decision I have to make as a writer. So all these things are happening, artists are responding to them, but a good writer doesn't go into a story, or any artist, doesn't go into a story with a message. That makes for bad fiction. But you do go in with a point of view, and that's the way you see the world. So I wanted to take my remaining time with you all and share with you a little bit about my own point of view. I have this theory that every single one of us, we are telling a story with our life, right? So every time you make a big decision, you move to a new town because you're out of college and you accept a job, you decide to get married, you're making these big decisions that alter the trajectory of your story. Well, if that's true, we're all living stories, we should also acknowledge that our stories don't exist in a vacuum, right? Our stories sit beside the people that are telling stories beside us, right? So for me, I always start where I'm coming from in terms of my point of view with these two people. These are my grandparents. This picture is taken in Tijuana, Mexico. They lived there their entire lives until my grandmother was going to have a baby, their first child. And they had this great idea. What if we could go to America and we might have more opportunities for our son in this new country? So they made the decision to move. Now, here's the interesting thing. They were in the very north part of Mexico. Tijuana's right next to the border. They moved right to the most southern part of San Diego. So they only traveled about 8 miles. But this was a massive trip, right? So they had to figure out where to live. They didn't know anyone. How were they going to get work? They were also undocumented. So they wanted nobody to know that they were there. And they landed in a place called National City. And there, my dad was born. By the way, they had no idea that they were going to have a grandson who was going to end up talking to you all right now in St. Louis, Missouri. So that happened. This is a picture of me and my dad. So my dad was their first son. He was the first in our family to be born in America, U.S. citizen. That's a picture of me. You could tell I kind of liked tacos when I was little. When I look at my dad, though, a couple important things come to mind. First of all, his first language was Spanish, but now he was in this new, context where English was spoken everywhere. So he had to change languages, right? And he couldn't get help from his parents. So he had to navigate that. What that led to is him being a very quiet person. He would never talk, right? He didn't want to make mistakes in terms of language. He would go to work, and by the way, he was the hardest working man I've ever met. He'd come home, but he wouldn't say anything to anyone. He would just watch TV and go to sleep. He actually got a job at the San Diego Zoo when we were about 5. I think I was 5, my sister was 4. And he started to think of the zoo as his identity. And he worked really hard. And over the course of our childhood, he moved up at the zoo. He worked at the beginning in the sanitation department. And then he slowly but surely moved up and he was an electrician's assistant. And then by the time I graduated high school, he got this job working in what's called the Tiger River Trail in the San Diego Zoo, where you actually did all the jobs. So one day you'd be digging trench, and then the next day you might be feeding the tigers. So he started to think like, wow, I've got this great job. It's providing for my family, which he did a great job of. Well, his son, who's pictured there, me, I was struggling in school. And, now I'm older and I can look back and try to pick apart why I was struggling in school, and in particular, why I was struggling to learn how to read. And first of all, we had no books in the house. I never owned a book of my own until I was in middle school. So if you're not surrounded by books, you're less likely to become a reader. So that's one factor. But I also lived in this interesting household where sometimes my dad would ask me a question in Spanish, but I wasn't allowed to speak Spanish in the house, so I'd have to answer in English. So I think I was a little confused with language, and it led to me not being a very good reader at the beginning. Well, by the time I was in 2nd grade, it was such a struggle for me that the school wanted to hold me back, have me repeat 2nd grade. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize, is when that decision is made, there are ripple effects that last for a long time. So I remember my parents came out of the meeting with the principal. I'm sitting in the back of their Volkswagen Bug, and they said, Matt, they're going to have you repeat 2nd grade. And I remember thinking as a little kid, wow, if I can't even get to 3rd grade, I must be a dumb kid. And so that stuck with me for many, many years. So I always went to school because I had a really good mother who, not the best picture I've ever taken, I understand. But this is my mom. She made sure we went to school every day, and she was the best mother you could possibly have, probably because she was raised in the foster care system, and all she wanted to do was keep a family together. So I went to school every day, but I didn't go there to succeed. I went there to survive. So I sat in the back of the class and just tried to get by. Luckily for me, I was pretty good at a sport, the sport of basketball. which I have to acknowledge, Jason Tatum is from St. Louis. That's my favorite player, so I'm happy to be here. I watched the game last night. Let's tune in Friday. Anyways, so I was pretty good at the sport of basketball, and because I was good at a sport, I got to go to college for free and become the first De La Peña to go to college. Now, this was a thrill. I got to go to college. I also knew, I played at a small Division I school in the same conference as Gonzaga, but I also knew I wasn't good enough to play beyond college. So I was there, I had a free education, but I would play pickup, my freshman year in the summer with guys that were just better than me. So I knew, I was gonna play all 4 years, but then now I have to figure out what I'm gonna do for work. What am I gonna do for a job? So I'll just kind of briefly tell you that I was introduced to the right book at the right time. A professor in the middle of campus, I'd had her the previous semester, approached me with a book, handed it to me and said, Matt, I was rereading this book last night and I thought of you. I'd never had a teacher or a librarian come up to me with a specific book and say, you have to read this. So I was curious. She also told me this. She said, look, you're not in my class this semester, so you don't have to take a test on this or do an essay. Just promise before you graduate, you'll read this book, and when you finish, come talk to me. And as a young guy, I thought, wow, that gives me 3 years. I could do that. So I took the book. I took it with me on a road trip to New Mexico, where we were going to play New Mexico State. And I pulled the book out late at night. My roommate was watching TV. I started to read it. And I'll be honest with you, I got through maybe 20 pages and I thought, why did this professor give me this book? First of all, it wasn't good. Second of all, the narrator was using broken English. And I thought, don't you have to speak perfect English to be a writer? And so normally this is when I would put a book down and say I just couldn't connect. But I needed to figure out why she gave me this book. Why me with this book? So that's the only reason I kept reading. I would say, I think I was on page 45 or 50 when I started to care about the main character. And this was interesting because she could do nothing for me. She was much older than me. She was a different race than me, lived in a different part of the country than me, but I cared about her. I wanted her to be okay. That's why, by the way, I think reading is the ultimate form of empathy. But so I kept reading. I read about 2/3 of the book that night. Put it down, went to sleep. The next day we had our shoot around, our team meal, our game. I didn't get back to the hotel until around 9:30 p.m. But for the first time in my life, I had this feeling, I gotta go find out what happens to that woman. Hustled back up to my hotel room, read the rest of the book that night, and I didn't stop until I got to the last page, and I noticed something that was shocking. I found myself on the verge of tears from a book. And I was like, how could black and white on a page do this to me? I couldn't believe it. Before I tell you the title of this book, I do want the guys in here to know I didn't actually cry that night. It's not an official cry unless a tear exits the eye. And what I did is I just looked up and it soaked back in and it was all good. But does anyone know this book, The Color Purple? So that single book changed my life, and here's how I understand it now. I grew up in a working class community with very, very tough cousins and friends in a neighborhood where to be a boy, you had to be tough. Nothing sensitive, not writing poetry, which I secretly did and nobody knew about, not reading books, not investing in school. So I put up this front like I could fit in to that group, but what I secretly needed is some way to feel. And books became my secret place to feel. I became an avid reader from that day on. I looked for that same feeling in every other book. I'll fast forward real quick because I want to bring my dad back in to end my time with you. So at the end of my college career, my professors did something incredible for me. I'll never forget. They took all the work that I had done in their creative writing classes, like 4 different classes, they put it together, they pulled me into one of their offices and said, we applied you to graduate school for creative writing. Do you want to go? You got into 2 of the 5 schools we applied to, you two. They were Fresno State and San Diego State. And I was like, what is an MFA? And they said, well, you can study creative writing to try to be a professional writer. We think you're good. That was the exact opposite of what I learned in second grade. It made me feel so empowered, and I wanted to pursue what they were saying I could possibly do. I chose San Diego State for one particular reason. Because while I was at college, my dad lost his job at the zoo because a new regime came in to the picture, and they created a new rule. They said, from this point forward, if you work within a certain proximity of animals, you have to have an animal science master's degree. Well, my dad was a high school dropout, so he was let go with a small severance package. I went to San Diego State not to support my dad because he was unreachable, but to support my mom and my youngest sister who was still there. We developed a routine. Every Sunday, I'd take the coaster, this little train from my college up to where their apartment was. I'd have lunch with my mom and my sister while my dad watched TV. He wouldn't interact with anyone because his job was his identity, and he was crumbling. Well, one day, I had just finished a book on the train, and he came up to me, and out of nowhere, he said, "Hey, Matt, what book is that you're reading?" And I was like, "Oh, it's 100 Years of Solitude by this guy named Marquez. It's this incredible novel. I just finished it." And he goes, "Okay." He goes, "You think I could read that book?" And I remember thinking at the time, I've never seen my dad read anything, not even the newspaper. You can't jump into Marquez. I got to start this guy with some Dr. Seuss. You can't, but you can't tell your dad that. So I said, sure, and I gave him the book. Went back to grad school, came back the next week, and I said, "Hey, Dad, did you read the book?" I was so excited to see what he thought. And he said, "No, I didn't get to it." So I was like, okay, well, he has nothing really holding him back, but we won't get into that. Following week, I asked him the same question, did you read the book? And he said, "No, I didn't have time." So I just considered the book stolen property at that point and moved on with my life. Well, 5 months later, he put the book down next to me in my lunch plate, and he said, "I finished the book." And I said, "What did you think?" And so what I realized is slowly but surely he was working his way through a very challenging text. And he said, "It was good." And I'm in graduate school at this point, so I'm ready for a deep breakdown. So I said, "Well, what did you think about all the generations of Buendios? What did you think about the magical realism?" And he goes, "Nah, seriously, it was good." So I was like, okay. Well, he followed me out of the apartment that day on my way to the coaster station, and he waited till my mom and my sister were out of earshot. And he said, "Maybe I could read all the books you read in your program." And I said, "Sure." So I started to give him every single book I read in graduate school. He read every single one of them. And at the end, he would tell me if it was good or bad. And then he started going to the local public library and asking her advice for what he should read. And I was like, "No, you are my Frankenstein." But you can't really do that. But when I sold my very first book, I moved to New York. My parents at the same time, they moved to Watsonville, California, which is kind of where we get a lot of food is harvested there, because my dad couldn't be in San Diego anymore because he associated San Diego with the zoo, and that was his identity, right? Well, I'm going to just kind of wrap it up here for you. I think I'm slightly over, but my mom called me one day, and she never calls me. She thinks she's bothering me. So I picked it up, and I was like, "Is everybody okay?" And she goes, "Yeah, everybody's okay." She goes, "But Matt, I don't know what's going on with your dad. He's not coming home until really late, even on weekdays." She goes, "Matt, I think he's having an affair." And I was like, "Mom, I don't think so. In order to have an affair, you have to speak to other human beings. He doesn't do that." And she's like, "I don't know, Matt." Well, what we later found out is that he had secretly enrolled to get his GED at the local community college. Why didn't he tell anyone? Because what if he failed right on the heels of a failure? He probably wouldn't survive it. But he didn't fail. He got his GED. And then he told everyone, which is me and my two sisters. And he didn't stop there, though. He ended up getting his AA degree. And then he didn't stop there. He transferred to UC Santa Cruz, where he declared his major as literature. And he recently, now it's been a few years, but he got a BA in literature. And now he's a third grade teacher. He teaches in a migrant community. And he teaches in Spanish. Recently, I went back with one of my kids so he could see my son for the first time. And I knocked on the door. My mom came out, and I was like, "Hey, I haven't seen you in a while. Great to see you." She just cared about the kids. So I was like, "Where's Dad?" She said, he's in the living room. This guy was sitting cross-legged on a rocking chair reading Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. He calls me over here, no hello, how's New York? He just calls me over and he reads a passage from it, and he looks up at me and he goes, God damn it, Matt, that's why we read Joyce. And I was like, who are you? But sometimes when you give a child or an adult the right book at the right time, it doesn't just change their reading habits. It changes the way they might navigate the world. And that same thing goes for theater. I've seen so many instances because of Last Stop where a kid sees theater for the very first time, sees himself or herself in the play, and thinks, I could do that too. And I think for me, that's what it's all about. So that is the hope for me. And this page in Last Stop starts with a very, very important line, in the darkness, because to me, what do we do in the darkness? That's what it's all about. And now my dad is a grandfather. He sometimes shares his cookies with my little chubby baby boy. And when I go back, I think he's going to be visiting us. So I'm going to end here again with my family. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of your evening. I hope you have a good rest of your night.